Welcome to Audiobook. This channel is dedicated to classic mysteries, dark thrillers, and timeless stories. Sit back, relax, and let the story begin.
Part 1: Hell Breaks Loose. 1. I don't think about death anymore. It takes too much energy, and God knows I need every bit of that. My name is Isaac Race. Both of my parents are dead, and so is my sister Rebecca. They were dead even before the attack. In fact, everyone I ever loved or cared about before is gone now. I can't complain, though. The others have lost everybody too. All except the twins, Ben and Brooke. They have each other at least. I guess I need to start at the beginning, before the hit the fan, as my last foster father used to say. Yeah, I said my last foster father. I had 2 after my parents died. That's where I'll begin my story, just before the Pyongyang flu killed all the grown-ups. Well, nearly all of them. Mom, Dad, and Rebecca were killed in a house fire just before I turned 14. I wasn't at home that Saturday night. I'd stayed over at my best friend Tommy's house. The cops and social workers all told me how lucky I was. I didn't feel lucky for a long time. I kind of wished I'd been home. Maybe I could have saved them. Or if not, at least I would have died too. Surely that would have been better than the awful, empty feeling that is only now starting to fade. If I died with them, we would have gone to heaven together. Well, that's what I thought back then when it first happened. I know there isn't a heaven now. There can't be a heaven without a God. And I know there can't be a God. No God could have let them do what they've done to us, could he? For years, America had been worried about North Korea getting nukes. It was confirmed during Trump's presidency, and things had gotten really tense. Missile tests, insults, and threats only ramped up the pressure. Kim Jong-un had eventually moderated his tone, and there had been meetings and diplomacy. But things always seemed to be close to boiling point, even into the next presidency. Throw in Putin's Russia making moves in Europe, and the main threats to the USA and everyone else seemed clear. Boy, had they been wrong. While the Pentagon's attention was diverted, the enemy they'd really needed to be concerned with was making plans and working on their strategies for expansion. It had suited them perfectly for North Korea and Russia to keep stirring the pot, keeping all the attention off them. None of it really matters now, I guess. What happened, happened, and we're the ones left to deal with the consequences. And all too frequently, that consequence is death. Just look at Sarah. She was the first that Luke and I found. She was a good kid, and only just beginning to come out of the shell she'd retreated into after Hell Week. Dogs got her. A pack had been stalking us for a few miles. They were hungry and mean. I'll never forget her screams. We shot 3 of them, but not before they'd nearly torn her arm off. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My world changed 2 years before everyone else's did too. Dad didn't arrive to pick me up from Tommy's at 10 a.m., the arranged time on the Sunday morning. I called home at 10:30 to see where he was, and all I got was the shrill beep, beep, beep of a busy signal. Mr. Benson asked me what my dad's cell phone number was, but I didn't know it. I'm sure he won't be much longer, he said, almost managing to mask his annoyance. Tommy and I went back to his room to play Xbox while we waited. When 2 hours passed with no word, the Bensons gave me some lunch. Tommy and I will drop you home after we eat. I know it sounds weird, but I kind of knew that something wasn't right. I'd had a strange feeling all that morning, a sense that something bad was going to happen. I didn't know it then, but it had already happened. When Mr. Benson turned onto our street, I knew before I saw them that there would be fire trucks. I don't know how, but I did. Sure enough, there they were, impossibly red on that bright, sunny, horrible afternoon. My house was a blackened pile of rubble. The remains of a rotten tooth in the perfect smile of big, neat houses that lined our cul-de-sac. Mr. Benson said the F-bomb under his breath and ran a hand through his thick hair. That word would normally have elicited sniggers from Tommy and me. Not that day. I think I was already in shock, and even Tommy had been stunned into an unusual silence. Mr. Benson was saying something to me when we pulled up. I didn't hear, though. The rushing sound in my head drowned everything out. I didn't want to open the door. It felt like when I did, I would be opening a door into another existence. Isaac, stay here with Tommy. I'll talk to the police officer. Mr. Benson's words finally cut through the fog in my head. It's okay, I said, and pushing past the dread, I opened the door. Noise assaulted my senses. People yelling! Water from fire hoses sizzling on smoldering timber. Someone crying by the mailbox, the one surviving man-made construction on our lot. Our beer-bellied neighbor, Bob Johnson, was talking to a police officer. His hair was wild and his face smudged with soot. Isaac! He yelled and rushed over. I took a step back, but he caught me and pulled me into a tight hug. Oh, thank God you're okay, Isaac. He began to sob, his big gut moving up and down against me as his tears wet my cheek. We stood that way for a long time. I didn't know what to say or how to escape his hug. Every time he tried to say something, he broke into sobs again. Finally, I heard a man's voice over his shoulder. Mr. Johnson, please. I'll talk to the boy. I stumbled a little as the big man let me go. The officer put a steadying hand on my shoulder and guided me to the fence that separated our two properties. That day is still a blur, but I remember looking back at the smoking mess that had been my home. Before the officer turned me back toward the street, that was worse. Tommy stood there with his dad's arm around his shoulder, identical looks of pity on their faces. And for the first time it hit me that I would never feel my dad's arm around me again. I started to weep as the officer spoke to me. I'm so sorry, son. I want you to know that your family wouldn't have felt a thing. It looks like the fire started in the kitchen, and they would have been sound asleep. The smoke going through the house meant they didn't wake up or feel pain. He paused, as if unsure how to go on. Do you have family we can call and get you looked after? Grandparents, cancer, uncles, anyone close by? I tried to man up, ashamed of my tears. Funny what things seem important to a 13-year-old. I shook my head. There was no one, I sniveled. All my grandparents are dead, and I don't have uncles or aunts. It's okay, son. We'll have someone take care of you here. Come and sit in the patrol car while I make some calls. The cop turned and headed off to his cruiser. I glanced at the crowd of people that watched from across the street and saw my dad looking right across at me. It was only a second before I realized it wasn't him, just a guy with a beard and similar colored hair. I felt a fresh stab of loss. That would happen a lot over the next few months. I would be doing something mundane, something where my mind was on autopilot, and I would think I saw one of them, Dad or Mom or Rebecca, at a bus stop, in a supermarket, in a queue at Starbucks. It was a cruel trick of the mind that allowed the reality of my loss to sock me in the guts over and over again. The cop stopped when he realized I wasn't following and reached from my hand. I absolutely shook him off and trailed him to the cruiser. He opened the door to the front passenger seat and I climbed in. I looked around, my boy's curiosity at being in a police car surfacing through the well of grief. For just a moment, I managed to stop crying and wipe my eyes as I listened to the cop make a call back to base. I knew it was about me, but didn't really absorb what was being said as he signed off. Tommy's dad approached to the driver's door. He whispered a few words in the officer's ear before passing him a card. The officer nodded and Mr. Benson came around to my side, his face serious. He put a comforting hand on my shoulder. Isaac, Tommy and I have to go. I've given the officer my details and told him they can call me any time, and so can you. Take it easy, son. I know it doesn't seem like it now, but everything will be better in a few weeks. He looked around. Tommy, come say bye to Isaac. Tommy looked reluctant as he shuffled forward and offered me his hand. That moment summed up the weirdness of the whole day. We never shook hands. It was always high fives and laying skin. Still seated, I took his clammy hand awkwardly and shook it. "See, Isaac," my friend mumbled, with his eyes down before stepping away. His dad looked at me one last time, pity in his eyes before putting his arm around Tommy's shoulder and leading him away. I started to cry again. The familiar faces of my friend and his dad were gone, and I was left with strangers. Most of them would have pity in their eyes too, but it was a kind of worn, businesslike pity. I might have been the world's newest orphan, but for them, just the latest in a long line. I never saw Tommy again. I won't bore you with what happened that afternoon or for the next few weeks, except to say that a social worker got there about an hour after the cop had made his call. Margaret, I don't remember her last name, was about my mom's age, but with the horned-rimmed glasses and dowdy clothes she wore, she looked much older. She was kind and somehow made me feel better as she drove me to the halfway house. She told me I would stay there until I was placed in a suitable foster home. I'm not going to write about my family's funeral, which happened a week and a half later. It's enough to say that it was the worst day of my life. My old life, anyway. I was at the halfway house for 3 weeks before Margaret visited to tell me that a suitable home had been found. I don't remember much of my time there, just the relief of leaving. I suppose I should have been nervous about meeting the new parents, but to be honest, I was still kind of numb. The Pratchetts lived about 30 miles away in a neat brick bungalow. When we were introduced, Mr. and Mrs. Pratchett insisted I call them Randy and Jenny, but as her husband saw Margaret out to her car, Mrs. Pratchett put her arm around me. "You can call me Mom if you want to," she whispered. It was insulting and insensitive, even if she was trying to be kind. But I didn't even get angry at that time. Not much seemed to get through. Randy and Jenny were in their early 30s and didn't have any kids of their own. At first, they seemed okay. They had a nice big house and put me in a huge bedroom with its own flat-screen TV, the latest PlayStation, and a computer. Jenny had shown me the room with a flourish, but with my loss still raw, I wasn't able to do more than say, "Thanks," in a flat tone. I know I was still grieving for my family at that stage, but from the start, there was something I didn't like about Randy. He seemed too good and wholesome to be true, almost as if he was playing a role in a family movie. Still, it was hard to put my finger exactly on what it was. One night, about a week after I moved in, he confirmed the bad vibe. I could tell instantly something was not right when I sat down at the table for our evening meal. He stumbled in from the living room. Jenny was unusually quiet and barely looked up from her plate as we began eating. No one had uttered a word when, after a few mouthfuls, Randy placed his fork neatly on the plate and, without warning, reached over the table and slapped Jenny across the face. Jenny began screaming. No words, just screaming. I was shocked by the suddenness, the quick violence of it. I sat with my mouth open, my mouth full of mashed potato, and danger is spilling out. Then he stood and slapped her again, harder this time, across the other cheek with the back of his hand. Jenny stopped screaming. She held her face in her hands and began sobbing quietly. I was stunned. I had only ever seen behavior like that on TV. My mom and dad had arguments, of course, but he had never raised a hand to her. Randy noticed me staring at him, open-mouthed. "What are you looking at, you little flexer?" he yelled at me, spit flying off his lips. He glared at me, but I wasn't scared. I think something was, and still is, broken inside me. I stared right back at him, not dropping my gaze from his bloodshot eyes, and finished chewing my mashed potato. I guess it freaked him out. Eventually, he broke eye contact and called me a foul name under his breath before standing up and kicking over his chair. I think that was the first time I realized that bullies, no matter how old they are, thrive on fear. And if you don't show it and then have the audacity to stare them down, they back right off most of the time. Anyway, he stomped across to the kitchen counter, snatched up his keys before storming through the door into the hallway. I heard the front door slam a few seconds later and then the sound of his car starting. I put my hand on Jenny's arm. "It's okay. He's gone. Are you all right?" My heart went out to her. Maybe I wasn't totally numb. Livid marks marred her pale cheeks and her eyes were filled with pain. I'm pretty sure it wasn't just physical pain. She smiled bravely and grasped in my hand. "Look at you. You're twice the man he is, and you're only 13. I'm so sorry you had to see that." "It's okay." We ate the rest of our dinner in silence. It was back to the halfway house for me the next day. Jenny had called the social worker first thing the next morning. "Sorry, Isaac. I guess I thought having a kid in the house would change him." I was worried for her, but she assured me she would be okay. She was packing her things and leaving Randy as soon as I had gone. She hugged me when I left, and I hugged her back just as hard. "Take care, Mrs. Pratchett, Jenny. Thanks for trying." Margaret, my social worker, was apologetic in the car. "I'm sorry, Isaac. Sometimes, even with all the background checks and interviews we do, the bad ones slip through the cracks." 9 days later, she took me to meet the Fosters. I didn't have much of a sense of humor at that point, or I might have found that funny. Fostered by the Fosters. Unlike the Pratchetts, I liked them both right away. They were older than Randy and Jenny and had been fostering kids for a long time. Their last foster son had just turned 19 and left for college a month before. They had an empty house and were ready to take on a new kid that needed a break. That kid happened to be me. I have to admit that as time went by, my numbness turned to resentment. Resentment of the world for taking my parents away. It shames me now, but some of that angst was taken out on the Fosters. I'd act out, get into trouble at home and at school. To their credit, they always accepted the place I was in and worked hard to make sure I knew that they'd be there for me. Slowly, I started to come around, and by the end, literally the end, we were getting along really well. So much so that I was almost beginning to think that I had found a new place to belong. Alan Foster was a retired postal worker, and despite any rumors or jokes that you may have heard about postal workers and their anger issues, let me tell you, Alan was one of the most mild and patient men that I've ever met. He was silver-haired and soft-spoken, and what I remember best about him was his quiet strength. Eleanor had been the stay-at-home mom for those before me and had a patience and calmness that complemented Alan. Sometimes I wonder if it hurt her how few of us ever actually called her by that title, Mom. I know I never did. Not when she could hear me, at least. I spent over a year and a half with the Fosters in a town called Fort Carter. I started at Fort Carter Junior High. While I was still dealing with the death of my parents and the hole that their loss had created inside of me, I had few friends at school. I pretty much kept to myself in the lunchroom and during breaks, and rarely spoke up in class unless I was called upon. The other kids thought I was weird, and to tell you the truth, I think most of the teachers did too. I ended up spending a lot of time in the school counselor's office. Mr. Jennings tried to break into my shell, and I resisted with all of my might. I had to admire his tenacity, though. I think he wanted to help me just as much as the Fosters did. One of the few joys in my life was Kung Fu. I took it up at Alan's insistence, and it was the best thing I could have done. I took to it like a toddler to ice cream, and before long, I was going 3 nights a week. I attained my black belt within a year, and even competed in the Rhode Island State Championships. Not only was it a good physical outlet for me, I look back now and see how much it did for my mental discipline, too. All in all, things were good and getting better. It was the middle of October when I recall first hearing that something was amiss. I had helped Eleanor clear up the supper dishes and wandered into the living room where Alan watched the news each evening. As I did so, I noticed the banner across the bottom of the screen, alerting the viewers of a special report. And now, some breaking news out of North Korea, Sarah Mulligan, the Channel 7 News co-anchor, was saying. Tom, we're getting reports of a flu-like disease that is sweeping the nation of North Korea, Tom Dallard said, taking over from his on-air partner. Preliminary reports suggest that as many as 1 million Koreans in the Pyongyang region have fallen ill with this mystery virus over the last few days. The North Korean government has closed their borders even tighter than they normally are, and their leader has not been seen in public in over 48 hours. Their government news agency has remained silent on the issue of the disease. Experts here in the U.S. believe that casualties could be in the thousands. He paused, looking at his notes, and then off to one side before looking back to the camera. We now take you live to a statement being given by Lloyd Ackerman, Chief of Public Relations for the Center for Disease Control. Doesn't look good, muttered Alan, as we watched the camera cut away to a shot of a tall man standing behind a podium burying the circular CDC emblem. I focused in on what Dr. Ackerman was saying. Isolationist policies make it hard for us to get accurate, real-time information on this outbreak. At the same time, those policies seem to be containing the outbreak to North Korea itself. At this point, all we know is the disease appears to be a fast-acting form of influenza. Symptoms develop rapidly after exposure, and in many cases, fatality occurs within a few days. Again, because of the nature of dealing with information from North Korea, we do not know the exact fatality percentages or the rate of infection at this time. We are coordinating with the FAA and the Department of Homeland Security to ensure everybody flying into the United States from East Asia will be quarantined for 24 hours after arrival to ensure that symptoms do not develop. We do not think there is a clear and present danger to the people of the United States at this time. But when dealing with a disease such as this, the situation is always fluid and can change at any time. I'll now take a few questions from the press. He pointed to a reporter in the crowd in front of him. How bad is this going to get, Doctor? Well, it certainly seems that there is a real mystery to this one. Flu season in Southeast Asia had been relatively good this year, so it is worrying that it seemed to come out of the blue, hard and fast. Ackerman replied, Whether it turns out to be something less dangerous than originally thought, like the infamous swine flu, is unknowable at this time. While that outcome is something we can all hope for, I think it would be wise to look at this as if it were the worst-case scenario until proven otherwise. And if that is the case, then yes, it is going to be bad, possibly very bad. Based on some of the reports coming out of North Korea, we could be looking at something as virulent as the Spanish influenza. But as I said, that is pure conjecture at this time. He motioned to another reporter, but Alan switched off the television before the question came. I often wondered later if Dr. Ackerman lived long enough to realize just how much his worst-case scenario had underestimated the flu that was, unbeknown to the rest of the world, decimating the North Korean adult population. Do you have any homework, Isaac? Alan asked from his recliner. No, sir, I replied. It was a lie, but a small one. I actually had a dozen math problems I needed to do for my algebra class, but I missed my class in the afternoon and figured I'd just do them at lunch the next day. It's not like I had any friends to hang out with during lunchtime. The next day, the Pyongyang flu, as it had been dubbed, was the talk of the school. According to the loose teenage gossip, it was going to spread and result in the end of the world. Bernie Bova, my lab partner in physical science, wouldn't shut up about how it was a government conspiracy and that President Riley had finally had enough of Kim Jong-un, his bad haircut, and his constant threats of nuclear war. Telling you, man, it's biological warfare. We're taking those down! At the time, none of us knew how close to the truth he actually was, although he got the source of the attack wrong. That sort of talk went on for a few days while news stories lingered on the evening news and in the papers. But then, like all news stories without a direct effect on the majority of Americans, they petered off, aided by the fact that the North Korean government had virtually sealed off their country, not only the borders, but also all telecommunication, media, and internet. Within a couple of weeks, there was nothing besides the occasional mention, regularly recycled stories, and speculation on the 24-hour news channels. Going about my daily life, I heard no news about the Pyongyang flu for nearly 2 whole weeks. Then, on Halloween Day, the Chinese government announced that they were sending an expeditionary task force over the border into North Korea. Communications from the North Korean government had by then ceased, and the American military had announced that their satellites were currently detecting little or no evidence of life. This essentially meant no movement of vehicles or transport, no communications, and little evidence of population in over 2 weeks. With this deafening silence hanging over North Korea, the Chinese had the support of the United Nations. Even our government, long critical of China's inaction when it came to North Korea, but also wary of their expansion in the Pacific, approved. Everybody wanted to know what had transpired there. Halloween didn't really mean a lot to me. I had never been much into candy, and at nearly 15 years old, I felt that I was a little bit too old for trick-or-treating. Even though Eleanor tried to talk me into it, I refused, politely of course, and spent the evening watching CNN's live updates of the Chinese expedition with Alan. The Chinese government was very forthcoming with what they were finding, releasing video footage to their own and Western news outlets, but drawing the line at a live feed. I had to suppress shudders watching the recorded video footage from the helmet cams of the Chinese soldiers. They were marching through a wasteland. Something like 96% of the adult population had succumbed to the infection. Children appeared to be unaffected, but the report showed them being rounded up by soldiers and transported to camps where the Chinese government assured the world they would be cared for until a long-term solution could be found. No one in the scientific community could explain why children seemed to be immune to the infection, although there was some wild speculation. While they were physically unaffected by the flu, being left to their own devices, alone and unsupervised, had not been kind to them. The first groups of children filmed seemed wild, almost feral, and I remember wondering how they could have fallen so far in such a short period of time. Watching them, some snarling and spitting at the soldiers, others staring dumbly, I was reminded of Lord of the Flies, the novel by William Golding. It's about a group of kids shipwrecked on an island with no adults. Left to their own devices, with little chance of rescue, the children's descent into savagery had been quick and not at all pretty. Perhaps Golding's fiction was pretty close to the mark. Within a day or so, the Chinese government's willingness to share information dried up. They occupied North Korea with a sizable force and declared it a quarantine zone. Their president, only in the job for less than a year and known for his aggressive politics, assured the world that their scientists were hard at work studying the disease and would reveal their findings when the study was complete. Needless to say, a diplomatic crisis ensued. Neither South Korea nor the U.S. was happy with China's forces crossing into North Korea, and the president ordered our Pacific Fleet into international waters off the coast of South Korea. For a few more days, the Pyongyang flu and the devastation of North Korea, along with the huffing and puffing and possibility of war, was on everybody's minds. But eventually, it slowly faded. Once more, deals were done, and China agreed to allow UN forces on the ground in North Korea. The normal reactions to a horrendous human disaster play down. Celebrities cried on TV and criticized the president for not offering more money. Politicians pledged to push through relief packages, and the conspiracy theorists threw their unsubstantiated theories around with wild abandon. Again, as the news cycle churned and it stopped being front and center, The celebrities and politicians moved on to their next pet cause, and North Korea and the Pyongyang flu faded from most people's minds. Nobody seriously suspected then that the Pyongyang flu was anything more than a terrible pandemic that science would soon tame, as it had done many times before. The fact was, besides the conspiracy theorists, nobody was even close to the truth. That the infection of North Korea was a trial, a dry run for the real deal. NK's isolationist policies had made it the perfect petri dish, and soon enough, the results of that experiment would be used to irrevocably swing the balance of power in the world. 2. 3 days later, I was in a dark mood as I sat in the school office during third period. It was my 15th birthday, but I wasn't really in the mood to celebrate. I had my head bowed and was doing my best to ignore the world around me. I was thinking about my parents and sister and the last birthday I had shared with them. It had seemed nothing special then, just my favorite home-cooked meal and a simple chocolate cake. But now, it was a precious memory. Funny how some things become more significant later on. My thoughts drifted to the North Korean children and how millions of them had also had their parents ripped from them. The world was a shitty place. I was faintly aware of somebody sitting down in the seat next to me, but kept my head buried in my hands. I didn't feel up to making conversation. "So, what are you here for?" I sighed. Some people just can't read body language. I thought about ignoring the question, but in the end, I sat back in my chair and looked up to see a tall, red-headed boy slouched in the plastic chair next to mine. I knew him, of course. Luke Merritt was my age and one of the more popular kids in my class, his outgoing personality more than making up for his freckles and gangly appearance. "Don't know," I said with a shrug. "I got a note to come see Mr. Jennings. How about you?" "I'm here to see Dan the Man," he said, referring to Vice Principal Dan Harrelson. Dan the Man was his nickname amongst the student body, earned by his easygoing, cool attitude toward the kids. Tyler Lane was bugging Sherry Dennison in PE, and when he grabbed her boob, I felt I just had to step in, you know? I mean, they're so perfect that no one with the IQ of a brick should ever be able to touch them. Ever! Anyway, one swift kick to the nards later, and here, something like 96% of the adult population had succumbed to the infection. Children appeared to be unaffected, but the report showed them being rounded up by soldiers and transported to camps where the Chinese government assured the world they would be cared for until a long-term solution could be found. No one in the scientific community could explain why children seemed to be immune to the infection, although there was some wild speculation. While they were physically unaffected by the flu, being left to their own devices, alone and unsupervised, had not been kind to them. The first groups of children filmed seemed wild, almost feral, and I remember wondering how they could have fallen so far in such a short period of time. Watching them, some snarling and spitting at the soldiers, others staring dumbly, I was reminded of Lord of the Flies, the novel by William Golding. It's about a group of kids shipwrecked on an island with no adults. Left to their own devices, with little chance of rescue, the children's descent into savagery had been quick and not at all pretty. Perhaps Golding's fiction was pretty close to the mark. Within a day or so, the Chinese government's willingness to share information dried up. They occupied North Korea with a sizable force and declared it a quarantine zone. Their president, only in the job for less than a year and known for his aggressive politics, assured the world that their scientists were hard at work studying the disease and would reveal their findings when the study was complete. Needless to say, a diplomatic crisis ensued. Neither South Korea nor the U.S. was happy with China's forces crossing into North Korea, and the president ordered our Pacific Fleet into international waters off the coast of South Korea. For a few more days, the Pyongyang flu and the devastation of North Korea, along with the huffing and puffing and possibility of war, was on everybody's minds. But eventually, it slowly faded. Once more, Deals were done, and China agreed to allow UN forces on the ground in North Korea. The normal reactions to a horrendous human disaster play down. Celebrities cried on TV and criticized the president for not offering more money. Politicians pledged to push through relief packages, and the conspiracy theorists threw their unsubstantiated theories around with wild abandon. Again, as the news cycle churned and it stopped being front and center, the celebrities and politicians moved on to their next pet cause, and North Korea and the Pyongyang flu faded from most people's minds. Nobody seriously suspected then that the Pyongyang flu was anything more than a terrible pandemic that science would soon tame, as it had done many times before. The fact was, besides the conspiracy theorists, nobody was even close to the truth. That the infection of North Korea was a trial, a dry run for the real deal. NK's isolationist policies had made it the perfect petri dish, and soon enough, the results of that experiment would be used to irrevocably swing the balance of power in the world. 2. 3 days later, I was in a dark mood as I sat in the school office during third period. It was my 15th birthday, but I wasn't really in the mood to celebrate. I had my head bowed and was doing my best to ignore the world around me. I was thinking about my parents and sister and the last birthday I had shared with them. It had seemed nothing special then, just my favorite home-cooked meal and a simple chocolate cake. But now, it was a precious memory. Funny how some things become more significant later on. My thoughts drifted to the North Korean children and how millions of them had also had their parents ripped from them. The world was a shitty place. I was faintly aware of somebody sitting down in the seat next to me, but kept my head buried in my hands. I didn't feel up to making conversation. "So, what are you here for?" I sighed. Some people just can't read body language. I thought about ignoring the question, but in the end, I sat back in my chair and looked up to see a tall, red-headed boy slouched in the plastic chair next to mine. I knew him, of course. Luke Merritt was my age and one of the more popular kids in my class, his outgoing personality more than making up for his freckles and gangly appearance. "Don't know," I said with a shrug. "I got a note to come see Mr. Jennings. How about you?" "I'm here to see Dan the Man," he said, referring to Vice Principal Dan Harrelson. Dan the Man was his nickname amongst the student body, earned by his easygoing, cool attitude toward the kids. Tyler Lane was bugging Sherry Dennison in PE, and when he grabbed her boob, I felt I just had to step in, you know? I mean, they're so perfect that no one with the IQ of a brick should ever be able to touch them. Ever! Anyway, one swift kick to the nards later, and here. "I'll be fine," Judith said. "There was a bug going around," Eleanor said, shaking her head. "Let me get you some warm salt water to gargle. Perhaps we can knock it out of you before it really sets up shop." "I hope so. I took a megadose of vitamin C this morning when I first noticed it," Alan said. "You know how I hate being sick." "Doesn't everybody hate being sick?" I asked earnestly. Alan smiled. "That they do, son." "Isaac, can you clean up the wrapping paper and put your gifts away?" Eleanor asked before heading to the kitchen to fetch the salt water for Alan. "John and Amy should be here soon." John and Amy were two of the kids they had fostered before me. John was in college now, down in Providence, and Amy was living up in Boston. Both still had strong feelings for the Fosters, though, and came to visit often on holidays. Amy even called them Mom and Dad. I had met both a few times before, and they seemed like good people. Just the sort of kids you'd expect to come out of a family life crafted by Alan and Eleanor. I gathered up my gifts and took them to my room, where I dumped them in a pile on the bed. I had to admit to myself that I was looking forward to Christmas dinner with John and Amy there. It would be almost like the family gatherings I fondly remembered from before. My grandparents had died just a few years before my parents. When I went back to the living room to gather up the torn wrapping paper, Eleanor was on the kitchen phone. "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that, dear. I hope you feel better soon." No, don't worry about it. Perhaps you can get up to visit before New Year's. I'm sure he'll understand. Get some rest and eat some soup. Chicken noodle helps your body get over bugs. Love you too. Bye, John. Eleanor looked tired as she put the phone down, but when she noticed me, she perked up. I knew it was just a front. That was John, she said. He's feeling a bit under the weather and won't make it tonight. Amy texted my cell phone a half hour ago, though, and she should be here any minute. I felt a small loss now that John wouldn't be coming. I really liked him. From the little pieces of information that the Fosters had given me, I knew his struggles had been far rougher than mine before he had come to live with them. That he turned out to be such a good, well-adjusted person and had the opportunity to go to college was a testament to the Fosters. I went and looked through the dining room window after I'd finished cleaning up the wreckage of the unwrapping. Snow had started to fall. It was the first snowfall of the year, and the weatherman had not predicted it. It looked like there was going to be a white Christmas in Fort Carter, Rhode Island after all. I dutifully lowered my head and clasped my hands as Alan said grace. At that time in my life, I was angry with God, but not completely ready to give up on the idea of his existence. The meal had been prepared with expectations that John would be there as well, so there was more than enough food to go around. Ham, cornbread stuffing, mashed potatoes and gravy, green bean casserole, pumpkin and apple pies for dessert. It was a veritable feast. Given the things I've eaten just to stay alive in the weeks since that day, I almost feel bad about taking that meal for granted. The conversation around the dinner table was merry, with Alan, Eleanor, and Amy all reminiscing about the past. At one point during the meal, my mood had taken a turn for the worse. Rather than making me feel better, being reminded of the family gatherings that I remembered so fondly actually made me feel down. Amy glanced over at me. "Why didn't you show me the presents you got after dinner?" she said, putting her hand on mine. "Mom said that you got a drone. I'm jealous. They never gave me anything so cool." I shrugged. "It's just a toy." Amy was nice enough, but she was older than John, in her mid-20s, and always seemed more like a visiting adult than a potential sibling. I ate a few more bites, but found that the food had begun to lose its taste. I could tell that one of my mopey moods, that's what Eleanor called them, was about to hit me hard. These bouts of unhappiness were less frequent since I'd been living with the Fosters, but I had not completely left them behind. "May I be excused?" I asked, looking up at Alan. "Sure, take your plate to the kitchen," Alan said. "Don't let yourself get too down in the dumps, though, mister. Later this evening, we're going to go caroling around the neighborhood, okay?" I got up, picked up my plate. "Is he still depressed?" Amy asked quietly as I went into the kitchen. I heard the question, but not the reply. We never did go caroling that night. When the time came, Alan was feeling much worse than he had been that morning and had developed a fever to go with his sore throat and cough. Amy said she was beginning to feel sick too before she left. She came up to my room to look over my presents and chat in an attempt to cheer me up. It was nice of her, and I appreciated it, but it was an awkward, stilted conversation. "He looked terrible," I said with typical teenage bluntness, during a particularly long pause. She really did. There were dark circles under her eyes that hadn't been there just 2 hours ago, and every few minutes she coughed into a handkerchief. I remember being amazed how she had gone from being perfectly healthy to obviously ill so quickly. Her hand fluttered to her throat. "Yes, I think I better get going." I held my breath as she gave me a hug and left. 4. An urgent rapping on my bedroom door woke me the next morning. The clock on my bedside table read 5:58. I sat up as another series of heavier raps cut through the sleep fog in my head. "Isaac!" "Yeah, Isaac!" "Alan isn't doing well this morning. I'm going to drive him over to United General," Eleanor called through the door. "Are you going to be all right here by yourself for a while?" "Yeah, sure," I replied, managing to keep the annoyance out of my voice. I was certainly old enough to look after myself in an empty house. I thought about jumping up to go with him, but by the time I had decided to act on those thoughts, I heard the car start up and back down the driveway. I got up anyway and wandered through the empty house. Some leftover ham and mashed potatoes provided a decent enough breakfast, and soon I wandered into the living room to turn on the television. The channel it was turned to was broadcasting a news report, so I switched it to another station, only to see more news. In fact, most stations were broadcasting breaking news. This must be big, I thought, and settled onto the sofa, remote in hand. I saw the familiar podium with a CDC emblem, and there was Dr. Ackerman walking up to it again. At first, I thought that they might be replaying the press conference from before Halloween, but I realized this was new as soon as Ackerman started talking. My breakfast felt heavy in my stomach as I listened intently. It has been confirmed that the infection known as the Pyongyang flu is currently sweeping the eastern seaboard of the United States. As he spoke, his face was emotionless as a stone slab. At this point, it appears that the disease only affects those people approximately 17 years old and up, or, to be more exact, people who have passed the growth stage where both the distal end of the humerus and the distal end of the tibia are fully fused. This generally happens between the ages of 15 and 17. We still don't know why this is. "What about adults?" one of the reporters shouted, briefly interrupting the press conference. Adults exposed to the virus have a high probability of contracting the disease. This seems to vary across phenotype or race, but at this juncture it is impossible to say whether people such as Native Americans are truly immune to the disease or if it simply takes longer for them to succumb. Ackerman held up his hands to quiet the growing murmuring among the reporters. "It is not my intention to cause a panic here. The CDC is getting ahead of this thing, and we should have the outbreak under control within a matter of days. The first case was reported yesterday, but not confirmed as Pyongyang flu until this morning. From what we can tell so far, it spreads like a normal flu virus, so wash your hands, cover your mouth and nose when coughing and sneezing, and stay away from crowded areas as much as possible." A man in a rumpled suit rushed up to the podium from off-camera, whispered something in Ackerman's ear, and passed him a sheet of paper. The CDC publicist's face drained of all color as he read the words before strewing the paper up into a tight ball. "What is it? What's happening?" the same reporter from before called. "CDC scientists have just confirmed that H3J2, the virus commonly known as the Pyongyang flu, is in fact a man-made biological," Ackerman said. I fancied that he had the same look on his face as mine when I had seen the smoking ruins of my home from the back seat of Mr. Benson's car. It appears to be airborne at this time. The latest estimates are that up to 90% of the population of the East Coast is suffering from infection. And the infection, the weaponized virus, seems to be moving westward at a rate of over 100 miles per hour. At this rate, every part of the continental United States, in fact, the entire continent of North America, will be affected within the next 24 hours. The CIA isn't yet calling this a terrorist attack, but, and this is purely speculation on my part, all signs are pointing that way. All hell broke loose in the conference room. The microphone caught the sound of women and men crying as dozens of reporters rushed for the exits. The more hardened veterans clamored closer, to Dr. Ackerman yelling, "More questions!" While to the left of the podium, I noticed the man who had delivered the awful message coughing into his hand. Ackerman only answered one more question, a high-pitched and panicked, "What do we do?" "Stay in your homes and pray to God." I switched off the television and went to the kitchen. Picking up the phone, I dialed Eleanor's cell number and waited impatiently as it went through to her voicemail. "Eleanor, I just saw on the news that the Pyongyang flu has been released here. They're saying that terrorists are spreading it around or something. Are you and Alan okay?" I managed to stammer out before the phone beeped again, ending the voicemail. Not sure what else to do, I hung up and then immediately dialed the number for Margaret, the social worker who had placed me with the Fosters. Once again, it rang out, and I got a message saying that she would be out of the office until January 2nd. Hanging up the phone, I went back to the fridge to cut off a bit more ham. I felt lost and alone. All I could think about was the grainy video of the feral children in North Korea. Eleanor and Alan returned in the early afternoon. She had not been able to get him in to see a doctor at all. The emergency room had been swamped long before their arrival. I helped her move Alan, by this point weak and delirious with fever, to their bedroom where she laid him down and covered him with a bedsheet. "Run to the freezer and bring me the ice pack," Eleanor said. "I'm worried that he's getting too hot." When I returned with the ice pack, she put it in a pillowcase and placed it on Alan's forehead. "Oh, Alan, please don't leave me," she whispered and kissed his brow tenderly. We sat by his side for a while, and then, after he'd fallen into a fitful sleep, went to the living room to watch the news. If anything, the situation had gotten even more horrific since I had turned it off that morning. We learned that the Chinese government was now admitting responsibility for the attack and claiming all of North America by right of conquest. Not terror, then. War. The other nations of the world were protesting loudly, but the threat to them was implicit, and they appeared afraid to make any real moves to help America for fear of the H3J2 virus being turned on them as well. Watching the sniffling and coughing reporters, we did learn a bit about the virus, though. The disease affected nearly all adults exposed, except for, it was rumored, those who were of ethnic Chinese origin. Its fatality rate was a staggering 96%. Those few that did survive were generally left as vegetables, with permanent brain damage as a result of the prolonged high fever that was associated with the infection. It seemed that the body could produce a previously unknown antibody to fight the disease, but it only did so from a few specific locations, all of them yet to be fused areas of bones such as the tibia and the humerus. By about age 16, though, those areas had fused and the body became incapable of producing the specific antibodies, ironically dubbed the funny antibody. Those under 16 or 17 exposed to the virus had the antibodies and would be forever immune to the virus. Those who did not faced almost certain death. The professionalism and bravery of the reporters, reporting while sick, knowing that they were most likely going to be dead within the next few hours, left an indescribable impression on me. I planned to fight with every last ounce of my being to stay alive. But I sincerely hope that if the time comes, I will face death with as much courage as those reporters did during Hell Week. Alan died around midnight. Eleanor lay down with him on their bed, her head on his shoulder, while she cried. I hugged them both and then stood and watched helplessly for a few minutes before going to my room. I sat on my bed with my arms wrapped tightly around my knees as I listened to her sobbing through the walls. It was happening again. I had finally started to feel like I belonged, and now my new family was being torn away from me just as surely as my real family had been. If anything, this was more painful because it was happening slowly, and even though I knew it was happening, I was powerless to stop it. Eleanor was sick too. She was trying to hide it, but I knew that within a day, 2 at most, I was going to be alone again. An hour and a half later, the sobbing stopped. At first, I thought she'd fallen asleep, but then I heard rustling in their closet. It backed onto the wall of my room so I could hear quite clearly as she rummaged around. Actually, it was less like rummaging and more like she was tearing the closet apart. I wondered what she was hunting for. Then the sound stopped. Several minutes passed and, believe it or not, in my sitting position, I began to doze off. Boom! I jumped, startled by the bang. When I realized what it meant, I wrapped my arms tighter around my legs. The house fell into a deep silence as I sat with tears running down my face. At some point I laid down, pulling the blankets over me. I slept deeply and dreamlessly until the morning light was shining through my window. I finally got up the courage to go into their bedroom, knowing with the same certainty that I had known about the fire trucks almost 2 years earlier what I would find. Eleanor was slumped across Alan's body. There was a red, mist-like spray on the walls and headboard of the bed, and Eleanor's arm dangled off the mattress, limp and lifeless. Near her open hand on the floor, there was a short-barreled revolver. I knew what she had done, but my mind refused to accept it. "Eleanor?" I asked, stepping forward into the room. "Eleanor?" "Mom!" There was no movement. Then moving closer, I saw the neat, perfectly round hole in her temple. A small amount of blood had leaked out of it and down the side of her neck, matting her shoulder-length hair in a dark clump. I didn't go any closer. I tried calling 911, of course, but I was greeted with a disconnected message. There was no signal at all on Eleanor's cell, so I used the landline to try calling John and Amy several times each. There was a dial tone, but only empty air. After I dialed their cell numbers, I put on my coat and went next door to the Moorcock house. They had always seemed like good neighbors, and I knew they would help if they were in any state. Nobody answered the door. Crunching back across the snow-covered lawn, I looked up and down our street. There was no movement at all, and despite looking like a winter wonderland, the familiar neighborhood landscape felt sinister and full of secrets. I picked up my pace and bolted the front door. Once I was back inside, I decided I would just have to close Alan and Eleanor up in their bedroom for the time being and deal with them later. After shutting their door, I headed into the kitchen, pondering my situation. There was plenty of food left over from Christmas dinner, and in the pantry, and the gas and electricity were still on too. The rarely used fireplace had a good stock of kindling and logs, and altogether, I guessed I could last a good month if I had to. Surely the authorities would get a handle on this disaster in that time. The TV channels started going off the air. That afternoon, with most of them completely off air by New Year's Eve, there were no fireworks that day. No big ball dropped in New York City. No one celebrated the turning of an era. America had fallen. It was a lonely few days. I read books, I tried the phone hundreds of times. I slept a lot and ate a lot more than I would normally through sheer boredom. It was on January 1st when the last news channel still on air reported that the Chinese army had begun landing on American soil. The Chinese government broadcast statements on radio and TV welcoming the children of America as citizens of New China and promising re-education and adoption into the New World Order. But Tom Dallard, the last news anchor doing live broadcasts from his station in Boston, told of Chinese soldiers rounding up the children of New York and Baltimore and other major cities and forming them into work gangs to clear bodies. He backed up these claims with a snippet of cell phone footage smuggled into his TV station. It was apparent that we were to be nothing but slaves to these new overlords. Dallard was one of the few non-Chinese people who seemed immune to the infection. Whether that was because of a genetic defect or because he had been exposed to a similar enough pathogen when he was younger, he was one of the 4%. He kept on reporting to the last, and on January 2nd, alone in an empty studio, talking to one camera that was focused on him, he spoke stoically over loud banging and the sound of breaking glass. It was distant, but getting closer every second. And so, America, children of America, time is running out for me. But know this, America is still the home of the brave, and it can again be the land of the free, where you can band together, find places to hide from the invaders, and live to fight another day. Avenge your parents any way that you can. Look out for each other. There was an even louder crash, and Dallard flinched. Somehow looking noble and brave even with the uncharacteristic 3-day growth and rumpled, unwashed clothes he wore. This is Tom Dallard's sign. I sat there with my heart beating hard in my chest as 2 Chinese soldiers tackled Dallard from his chair before he could complete his sign-off. One hit him viciously over the head with his rifle butt, and then they bent over and dragged his unconscious figure out of view. For the second time in a few days, I heard a loud gunshot. This one signifying the end of the America buck. I had known. I sat staring at the screen for a long time, feeling sick to my stomach. Tom Dallard, in my mind, was the last American hero, and he deserves to be remembered with the rest of them. January 4th, 2 days after the live broadcast death of Tom Dallard, was the day I realized I was going to have to fight to survive, and to perhaps do things that no 15-year-old kid, no kid at all, should have to do. That was the day the looters came to my neighborhood. It had been at least a week since I had seen anybody in our street. Not really surprising considering most of the people living there had been around the same age as the Fosters, their children already grown and gone. I was flicking through the channels on the television, trying to find anything at all, when I heard the rumble of a car engine. I ran to the window and peered through a crack in the blinds. A red Toyota pickup truck was cruising slowly down the street, its exhaust plumbing in the cold winter air. Excited to see someone, anyone alive, I nearly ran right out to wave them down. Something, a feeling maybe, stopped me, and I decided to watch them through the blinds instead. It slowly cruised right to the end of the street and turned the corner. I was suddenly regretful. Maybe they were looking for survivors, just people trying to help. I had to find out. I quickly grabbed my coat, pulled on my shoes, and ran for the front door, my heart beating hard as I grasped the door handle. I heard the rumble again. They had gone around the block and were coming my direction again, and it sounded like they were driving more slowly than before. Again, I decided against running out to wave them down and went back to my position at the window. Within a few seconds, they came into view and then stopped in front of Judge Peterson's house. It was across the street and 2 houses down. The doors opened and 3 people got out. One was a man with grayish hair. The others looked to be teenagers, one about my age and the other as big as the man. The man stopped just after getting out of the driver's door to lean across the hood, coughing as he straightened up. I was shocked to see he had a long gun in his hands. As I watched, the teens reached into the cab of the pickup and took out more guns. I didn't know that much about guns then. Everything I knew about them came from television and movies. But I recognized that the 2 younger figures carried double-barreled shotguns, and the one held by the coughing man was a rifle. From my vantage point behind the blinds, I saw the man wave toward the Peterson house, directing the teenagers to the front door. The boy tried the handle, and when he found it locked, he stepped aside for the man who busted it open with one strong kick. They disappeared inside. Maybe 5 minutes later they emerged, each carrying a large black garbage bag filled, I assume, with whatever they had looted from Peterson's home. They trotted back to the pickup and dropped the bags in the bed. The sick man then pointed to the house next door to the Peterson residence, and the teenagers disappeared inside. A sliver of fear shot through me. What if they came to my house? I didn't know what they were looking for, money, jewelry, or just food and supplies. But given the fact that they were armed, I was more concerned about what they might do if they found me here. Just as worrying was the idea that if I managed to hide and they didn't find me, what would I do if they took all the food? One thing I knew for certain. I'd have a better chance against armed men if I was armed myself. So, with gritted teeth, I left the window and ran to Alan and Eleanor's bedroom. It had been a week, and the smell of spoiling meat hit me as soon as I opened the door. I tried not to look at the bodies of my foster parents as I paused at the threshold of the darkened room. To say I was creeped out would be sugarcoating it, and for a second I almost turned around. Armed looters or no armed looters? In the end, I took a deep breath and crossed the room, still averting my gaze from them. I bent and reached out for the shape of the revolver on the floor. That was when my elbow bumped the bed and Eleanor's cold, stiff hand fell onto mine. The shriek that escaped my throat would have been right at home in a horror movie. I snatched up the weapon and jumped away from the bed and stopped, my heart hammering painfully in my chest. I was about to leave when my eyes fell upon the open gun case sitting on the dresser. It was lined with foam cut out in the shape of the gun and had another rectangular cutout which contained a box marked Remington 38 Special. I pulled out the box and opened it. It was full of extra bullets. Grateful, I slipped it under my coat and into the pocket of my gray hooded sweatshirt before heading out and back to the front window. Although it had seemed like an eternity, my trip to the Foster's bedroom had been brief enough that the two teenagers had not yet returned to the truck from the second home. I watched the driver. He was now slumped against the front fender of the pickup, his hacking cough clearly audible to me. I wondered vaguely how much longer he'd last. Certainly not more than another day, but then he must have been tough to last this long. I know it might seem horrible, me thinking about the life of another person in such an abstract way with no real sense of pity, but survivors adapt, and one of the first things that seems to go is compassion. I think the previous couple of years had already stunted my empathy toward my fellow human beings, so maybe I already had a leg up on the other survivors. A minute after I returned to the window, the looters returned to the truck and dumped their goods. Almost in slow motion, I saw the man point in my direction. Not at me, of course, but at my home. The older teen, perhaps only a few years older than me, maybe 16 or 17, but large for his age, gestured to the younger guy, and they crossed the road and started across the snowy lawn towards my front door. Time was up, 7. I dug under my coat and pulled out the gun. Now I was committed to using it. The weapon seemed heavier. I was reminded of Frodo's ring approaching Mordor. With shaking hands, I stuck the barrel through the blinds, and the cold steel muzzle chattered against the glass pane. I think they saw me at the last second, but it didn't matter. I pulled the trigger. The handgun bucked in my hands to report far louder than I had expected, but the bullet made nothing more than a jagged little hole as it passed through the glass. The man leaning against the fender jerked and grabbed at his thigh, his scream of agony cutting like a laser through the ringing in my ears. I hadn't been aiming at him. I hadn't been aiming at anything in particular. I just wanted to scare them off. But my round had found him anyway. He was sliding down onto the road holding his leg when everything exploded. The window detonated, the blast ripping through the wooden blinds. The blinds themselves protected me from the majority of the flying glass, and the shotgun pellets had struck about a foot to my right. I fell to my knees and scrambled behind the sofa. Another shot blew the blinds completely off the window, and they clattered onto the floor. I thought about going back to the window and shooting back, but I was clearly outgunned. They didn't know that, though, and I realized my best chance of survival was for them to give up. Precisely because they didn't know what awaited them inside. If not, I would put a bullet in the first one through the door. I slithered along the floor in front of the sofa until I could see the front door through the opening into the hallway. I lay there, watching the front door with the gun at the ready, for what may have been a minute, when it dawned on me that they might circle around the house and come in the pack. I was about to get up when I heard the man I shot screamed to his partners in crime. "Forget it! Get me home, you Egypts!" I held my breath until I heard the truck start up. Keeping low, I crawled across the room to the second window, and half expecting to find myself looking down the barrel of a gun, I parted the blinds and peeked through. The wounded man had been loaded into the bed at the pickup and was sitting with his back to the rear wall of the cab, his face a wreck of agony. As the younger boy climbed in, he had barely settled when the pickup, now driven by the older boy, took off with a squeal of tires. Luckily for me, they had cut their losses and run. I let out a long The encounter prompted me to take stock of my situation. I had probably a week's worth of canned goods left. The milk, eggs, and other perishables from the refrigerator were gone, all except for a half a bottle of Eleanor's prune juice. I had never touched the stuff and didn't plan on starting now, no matter how thirsty I got. There was also a 6-pack of beer Alan had bought to share with John on Christmas Day. I stayed away from the beer, too, not because I had any aversion to alcohol or anything, but I wasn't a huge fan of the taste. In any case, my mind needed to stay sharp and alert in case more looters came. The danger presented by the looters had given me quite a wake-up call. So, after a meal of canned baked beans, I did a karate workout, running through my old sparring drills and doing push-ups and sit-ups while I worked out. I thought about the prospect of the looters returning for revenge, perhaps a bigger danger than my dwindling supplies. I seriously considered packing up what I could in the Foster's car and driving away right then. 2 things stopped me. First was lack of a clear destination. Where would I go? I had some vague notion of going to Canada, even though I had seen some reports that the flu would spread there. I didn't think they were the real target of the Chinese, just collateral damage. Second, I really didn't know how to drive. The power went out sometime before dawn the next morning, and the decision was made for me. Whether or not I could drive or had a place to go, it was clear I couldn't stay where I was. I found the keys to Eleanor's car and her purse on the kitchen counter and gathered some warm clothes, a couple of blankets, and what food I had left, and loaded it into the back seat of her Honda Accord. I opened the garage door, lucky it was not powered, and started her car again. Lucky it was an auto. I let it run as I went inside to grab the gun and ammo. On the way out, I stopped by the Foster's bedroom door and placed my hand on it. I had cried a few times since they had passed, mainly at night when I went to sleep, but I still had a tear or two left for them. "Thanks for everything," I said quietly, before turning and heading out the front door without looking back. Driving was not as difficult as I had thought it would be, although I'm pretty sure I wouldn't have gotten 3 feet if it had been a manual. I had managed to reverse the old Honda out of the garage and down the driveway onto the road without hitting anything. Once I was on my way, the stiff steering took a bit to get used to, but the fact that there was no traffic and probably wouldn't ever be again helped me get the hang of it. I still didn't have a clear idea of where I wanted to go, so I decided to head over to Main Street. Fort Carter is, or rather was, a small town between Providence and Woonsocket. Main Street is the only place that could be considered a business district. There were the customary diners, antique stores, bakeries, and boutiques, along with City Hall, the police and fire stations, a small-town museum, and a supermarket. The United General Hospital, where Eleanor had tried to take Alan the day after Christmas, was located out of town, halfway between Fort Carter and Mapleville. Neighboring town at the far end of Main Street, where it ended in a T-junction with State Highway 102, was the newest addition to the town, a Walmart that had opened just 6 months prior, to much excitement from the locals. I decided to head there, but when I spotted the sign for the grocery store in the distance, I thought it might be worth a look. Maybe I could grab some more supplies, of the edible kind. The streets of the town were deserted and dusted in a light snowfall, but I kept my eyes peeled as I drove. At least the red pickup would stand out like a beacon if it was anywhere nearby. It was surreal. Most of the homes I passed didn't have cars in the driveways, and I assumed most people had fled, because the streets were mostly empty of vehicles as well. When I got to the parking lot of Dave's Marketplace, I saw maybe a half-dozen cars parked there, but from the snow on them, it was obvious they had been there quite a while. There were no lights on anywhere, which meant the entire town had lost power, not just our neighborhood. Pulling up close to the doors of the supermarket, I surveyed the windows, looking for signs of movement before finally switching the car off. I got out of the car as quietly as I could and walked to the doors with my hand in my coat pocket on the reassuring shape of the gun. The doors failed to hiss open like they normally did, and for a moment, I stood there perplexed, before I remembered the power was out. How am I going to get them open? I thought. I placed my hands on either side of the join and attempted to get my fingers between the panes so I could pull them open. Isaac! Isaac, race! I jumped as the deep, muffled voice ripped through the frigid silence and spun around to locate the owner of the voice. Standing at the corner of the building, a tall figure with a strange black face and huge eyes glared at me. 8! I took 2 hurried steps back, scrambling to pull the gun from my pocket as the figure stepped forward and reached up to its face, which I only realized then was covered by a gas mask. The figure pulled away the mask to reveal the familiar smile and red curls of my classmate.
Luke! Isaac! It's me! Luke! Whew. Luke! Jeez, you scared the hell out of me,
I said, regaining my composure. I released the .38 script, surprised and happy to see someone I actually knew. It was like finding a gold coin in a pile of... a small miracle. Luke seemed to think so too and crossed to me in 3 big strides, his long arms opened wide. Never one for shows of affection, I stuck my hand out to shake and avoid his embrace, but he was having none of it. He neatly dodged my hand and engulfed me in a bear hug that lifted me clean off my feet. Holy crap, Isaac! I thought I was the only one left around here, he said, dropping me back to earth and gripping my shoulders. Are you feeling okay? He asked, looking into my eyes. No sniffles or aches. Nothing but some cracked ribs thanks to your hug, I said, catching a little of his enthusiasm. His rich laugh bounced around the empty car park. What are you doing here? I asked. It was a pretty lame question to ask someone you just found after the end of the world, but it was all I could come up with short notice. Same as you, I imagine, he said, grinning. I came to do some shopping. What's with the gas mask? You know you'd already be dead if it was going to kill you, right? Yeah, but I found it in the disposal store and looked kinda cool. He shrugged and threw it aside. I felt kind of mean for calling him out on it. I nodded to the supermarket. Is there anything left in there, do you think? It's been over a week since the hit the fan. I thought of Alan when I said it and quickly suppressed the stab of pain it brought with it. I hope so, man, he replied. I ran out of food yesterday and I'm hungry as all get out. Well, let's do this then. Luke had a small hunting knife and leather case on his belt, and he used it to wedge between the doors and pry them slightly open so that we could get a grip. Working together, we managed to pull them open with some sweating and cussing. Luke reached out and grabbed the shopping cart to wedge between the doors. He knuckle-bumped me. Ready? Yep, I said, and we scrambled over and entered the dark supermarket. It's a good idea to keep our lines of retreat clear, he said, looking back. Never know what or who you might run into. The place looks deserted, I replied. They always do, he said, with a derisive snort as he led the way down the first aisle. Dude, haven't you ever played Wasteland 4? I grabbed an abandoned cart and we began our shopping in earnest. We stayed away from the produce and meat sections in the last aisles where the stench of spoiling food was strong, but found the rest of the store surprisingly well stocked for a week after an apocalypse. The poorly lit, messy supermarket was a little spooky at first, but Luke made it fun and we were anything but stealthy. We filled my shopping cart with cans of food and Luke grabbed a second one. He had the presence of mind to fill his cart with as much bottled water as he could. I grabbed a 12-pack of Coke, thinking I might need something to keep me awake when I was traveling. Of course, being kids, we also hit the candy section hard. We cleared entire shelves of M&Ms, Milky Ways, and Snickers, my favorite. "So what's your plan once we're stocked up?" Luke asked as we pushed our carts toward the front doors. "I'm not sure," I replied. "Do you know if Canada was hit by the attack?" "Canada's gone, man," he said, shaking his head. "Last I heard, everything north of the southern Mexico border has been hit." Damn. So all that's left of the United States is now made up of Hawaii, Guam, and Puerto Rico? I guess so, but I don't think the U.S. still exists at all, he said with a shrug. I think this is just the North American province of China or something now. How could somebody, anybody, do something like this? I don't know, man, he said. It's pretty messed up. That was the understatement of all time. Hey, if you want, you can hang with me for a while, he said, his face hopeful. If you want to, that is. I don't know. I was hoping to get the hell out of town before the Chinese soldiers get here. I didn't mention the looters in the red truck to him. If they're rounding up kids in the major cities, it's only a matter of time before they start looking in the smaller towns and suburbs. Okay, well, at least come over until you decide what to do. Besides, it would make it a lot easier to get my stuff there if we use your car. All right then, I replied. Where's your house? Not my house, man. I've been living at Walt's Diner since my parents... His voice hitched unexpectedly, and he took a second to compose himself. I've been living there the last few days. Best place in town to hang. It's got a wood fire grill that they use for cooking their burgers and steaks, so you don't need electricity to cook. Smart, I nodded. Sure, I'll give you a lift. Maybe.
Even stay a night.
Awesome, man, Luke said. Now, let's get this stuff loaded. 9. I didn't just stay one night. Truth is, I didn't want to head out on my own, and I'm pretty sure Luke didn't want me to either. We spent the next few days in relative comfort, eating well and watching out for signs of the Chinese army in our area. After 4 days, there had been no dramas. No sign of anyone, in fact. It was as if we had the whole town to ourselves. Luke and I became firm friends. He was a unique character, nerdy but knowledgeable in the ways of the world. While he was obviously a bit of a computer geek, his parents had clearly encouraged him to spend plenty of time outdoors. He knew a lot about everything to do with guns and military, even history. One time I asked him why he thought the Chinese had done what they had. Lebensraum. What? I looked at him blankly. Lebensraum. It's a German word. It means living space. Hitler used it as an excuse for his invasion of other countries in Europe. It was to provide room for the superior races to live as they expanded and took over the world. Okay, I frowned, not completely understanding. History has never been my strongest subject. Well, think about it, he said, taking on the tone of a teacher. China has a population of over 1.4 billion people in an area roughly the size of the U.S. That's 1 billion more than us. Well, 1 billion more than we had. And everyone knows that the world's population was getting bigger every day. It was going to get pretty grim over the next 50 years. There would have been wars over food and oil and probably land. Well, why yes. Why not somewhere like Australia, which is nearly empty anyway? Luke shook his head. Isn't it obvious? As much as I hate what they have done, it was a pretty masterful plan. Defeat your only rival superpower, take their land and resources. No one will try and stop you because everyone else is afraid the same thing will happen to them. And it's all here for them once they clear away the dead. Homes, cities, transport. All they gotta do is move in. Do you think they meant to only kill the adults? That I'm not sure of, but it does make sense if they wanted easy-to-manage, cost-free labor to help clean up the mess they made. That particular conversation left me a little depressed. It made a horrible kind of sense. Help was not coming. Would our allies risk their own people for what was left of America? I didn't think so. We were on our own. We spent much of those few days in the diner's kitchen, where the wood-burning grill provided not only a place to cook, but also heat to stave off the cold Rhode Island winter. Although the temperature had climbed above freezing, allowing what remained of the snow to melt away, it had not cracked 40 degrees and was dropping well below freezing at night. Luckily for us, old Walt had kept a good supply of firewood on hand. It was stacked beneath a tarp against the wall in the alley behind the diner. Not wanting to advertise our presence, I'd parked the car in that same alley, so on those few occasions that we did leave the diner, we always came and went by the back door. Although we did talk about moving on, the warmth and safety of the diner meant we became a little complacent, and the urgency to move on gradually faded. On the morning of our 5th day together at the diner, I was out in the main dining room rating the peppermint candies that sat next to the register while Luke slept in the back. I was about to put one in my mouth when I glimpsed a flash of red from the corner of my eye. Turning my head, I saw a familiar red pickup cruising down Main Street past the diner. I ducked fast and crept to the window, watching as it pulled to a stop in front of the hardware store 3 doors down. There were a bunch of scared-looking kids in the back. I counted 6, both boys and girls, and none looked older than 12. They sat quietly as the driver, the older teen from before, and his younger partner in crime got out. The looters both carried the same shotguns I had seen them with in the Foster Street. There was no sign of the man I'd shot in the leg. Probably the sickness or the bullet wound had claimed him. The driver went to the back of the truck and lowered the tailgate. The kids cringed away from him. "Hey man, what's up?" Luke called from behind me. I quickly turned and waved him the silence and beckoned him to the window. He was by my side in a flash and crouched down beside me. "Those guys came through looting our neighborhood before I left my foster parents' house," I spoke quietly. "No kidding. What happened?" "I shot one of them and they took off," I said without taking my eyes off the pickup. "You did what?" If I hadn't been concentrating on the scene outside, I might have smiled at his absolute surprise. "I shot one? Well, it was kind of an accident." "You have a gun?" "Yeah, it's in the pocket on the front of my coat," I said, glancing at him sheepishly. "Sorry, I was going to tell you, but I forgot." He didn't seem too fussed. "Should we go get it?" he asked. We watched as the older teen herded 3 of the kids from the back of the truck toward the hardware store. The kids went on ahead while he followed them with a shotgun at the ready. Obviously, they were now using kids to collect supplies faster. The younger teen stayed with the 3 kids still in the back of the Toyota, resting against the dray with a shotgun between his legs as he lit a cigarette. "I guess we better have it just in case they try to get in here," I replied. "You keep an eye out and I'll go get it." He nodded and I crossed the dining room at a crouch, heading into the kitchen. My stuff was piled in the corner by the door to the alley, and I realized how foolish I had been to leave the revolver there. What if the looters had come here first? What if they had come through the back door while we were out front? It was a frightening idea. I didn't want to end up as a slave to anybody, not the Chinese, and certainly not to a couple of goons with shotguns. I had just pulled a revolver from the pocket of my coat when I heard a gunshot from out front. Even in a building 100 feet away, it was shockingly loud. 38 in hand, I rushed back to the door into the dining area where I saw Luke flatten to the floor beneath the window. He waved for me to keep back, and I stepped back into the darkened kitchen just as the younger of the shotgun-wielding looters sprinted by the diner's front window. I heard another shot, this one much louder and from the alley beside the restaurant. Luke crawled across the dining room floor to join me, just inside the kitchen. The 3 kids that the younger guy was watching made a break for it as soon as the others were in the hardware store. Luke said breathlessly. "They ran this way. Come on," I replied, pulling him back into the kitchen. "Grab a knife or something and we'll watch the back door of this place in case he looks for them in here." Luke grabbed a wicked foot-long chef's knife from the block at the food preparation counter and hurried over to the door where my stuff lay scattered. From there, he'd be hidden behind the door as it opened. I moved to squat behind the end of the grill where I had a clear view of both the back door and the door to the dining room. The revolver again seemed unnaturally heavy in my sweaty hand. A full minute passed, then another. I was just starting to think that the danger had passed when the back door handle began to turn. Taking a deep breath, I pointed the revolver at the door and tried to decide if I should just shoot through it or not. Luke raised a hand to stop me and quietly placed the knife on the linoleum floor. He stepped to the door and yanked it open to reveal a pale-faced girl, her blue eyes wide in surprise. Luke clapped a hand over her mouth and pulled her into the kitchen, grappling with her, frantic wriggling as he shut and locked the door with his free hand. I didn't recognize her. She was a few years younger than us, probably 10 or 11. She was whimpering and struggling to escape Luke's grip. I put my gun on the counter and went across to them. "It's okay," I said, my hand spread in what I hoped was a non-threatening manner. "We aren't going to hurt you, but you have to be quiet, or the boy that was chasing you might hear." "Okay." She still looked frightened but nodded. "I'm going to take my hand away now," said Luke calmly. "Don't scream or he'll find us." Luke took his hand away. "Whoever," she started to say, but was cut off by Luke's hand again. He put a finger over his lips and shook his head before taking his hand away again. "I think he's in the alley," Luke whispered as he leaned in close over us. We strained to hear what might be happening. I heard it first, or at least I reacted to it first. Looking up toward the ceiling and then back down on Luke. It was a distant rumble that was growing louder by the second. Soon, the chop, chop, chop blades cutting through the air was unmistakable. A helicopter. Big, by the sounds of it. The rumble closed overhead and grew until it made utensils and plates in the kitchen tremble. There was a frightened shout from the alleyway. "Sounds like he's running," I said. Luke nodded, his eyes bright with excitement or fear. He looked at the girl. "I'm Luke, and this is Isaac," he said, quickly answering the question he had silenced with his hand. "We need to move. Come on and stay down," I said, and headed toward the dining room. The younger of the two armed looters was crouched 20 feet away under a bus shelter. If he had heard us while he was in the alleyway, he didn't show it. Focused as he was on getting back to his pickup truck, we cautiously made our way to the window and watched as he darted from under the cover of the shelter and sprinted for the truck. The driver was already herding the kids he had taken into the hardware store into the back of the truck. "Hurry the hell up!" he yelled to his partner as he slammed the tailgate closed and ran to the driver's door. The kid barely managed to jump into the back of the truck before his partner started the truck and tore off down the street. The children in the back were huddling in fear, while the armed kid leaned defiantly on the back of the cab and raised his middle finger in salute. We couldn't see the helicopter from our position. It was too high above the street, but the roar of the engine told us it was following them. Then, the kid made a mistake. His last. He raised his shotgun skyward. "Don't do it, idiot!" rasped Luke. He did. The shotgun kicked in his hand somewhere overhead. I heard a whining roar and willed the pickup to go faster. Do you know how in the movies a line of machine gun fire will leave little pock marks in the road as it creeps toward a target? That didn't happen. Instead, a section of road about 2.5 feet wide was pulverized to powder by the rapid-fire ammunition that began to make a deadly beeline at the fleeing vehicle. It reached them in barely a second. "No!" I screamed, thinking of the helpless kids as the truck was sawed in half by the withering fire. I lost sight of them in the flying debris and dust. That is something I am eternally thankful for. My heartbeat thudded in my ears as we waited under the window with the chopper land and its occupants searched the area. If so, we were toast. From the look that Luke gave me, I could tell he was thinking the same thing. Finally, after circling for what seemed like an hour, but was in fact probably only 5 minutes, the chopper flew off. It was then I noticed the gentle sobbing between Luke and me. I looked down at the girl, but left it to Luke to comfort her. I was too angry at the massacre I had just witnessed to do anything else. I knew that the time had come to leave, but after seeing the fate of the truck, I was not sure that driving was the best idea. I still had no idea where to go, and neither did Luke. Although somewhere during that few days, we came to an unspoken agreement we would go together. Surprisingly, it was the girl who helped us come up with a destination, 10. Her name was Sarah, and that afternoon, as we got over the shock of what we'd witnessed, she revealed that she and her friends had come from Providence. Barbara, an older girl, had been driving them north to some sort of refuge when the looters in the red truck had ambushed them a couple of miles outside of Fort Carter. Sarah was obviously traumatized by her recent experiences, so getting information out of her was like pulling teeth. But over the course of the next few hours, we managed to learn the important parts of her story. Sarah and her friends had been at a Bible school Christmas retreat, which was supposed to last from the day after Christmas until New Year's Eve. The last time she had ever seen her parents was when they put her on the bus to be taken to the retreat. Speaking of them, brought a fresh bout of tears, but she persevered with her story. After some coaxing, the 4 adult camp counselors, some already coughing when they arrived, had all been sick by the time night fell and had left in a car to seek medical attention. After serving dinner, they left the younger children in the care of Barbara, a 16-year-old high school student who was counseling at the camp for the first time. They didn't come back. Phones didn't work. A snowstorm hit. Barbara was so nice, really smart too, and she looked after us, but we were all freaking out. She kept telling us help would come, but it never did. When New Year's Day arrived with no contact from the outside world, the children had confronted Barbara. They knew she had been hiding the worst of what had happened from them, knew she had been watching the TV for updates when she could. She didn't deny it. She had kept silent while their whole world was swept away by the biological strike. But when the airwaves went dead and it was clear that no one was coming, she told the children everything. She had comforted them, letting them know God was still watching over them. I felt a bitter stab at that, but didn't say anything, not wanting to upset Sarah any more than she was already. It was Barbara who had found the message while cycling through the static of silent radio waves. She was looking for news or music or anything to prove that they weren't alone. On one particular frequency, the static would be interrupted by a series of beeps every hour, and the beeping would last no more than 3 minutes at a time. A 10-year-old boy called Johnny said it sounded like Morse code. He said he had studied it in Scouts and tried writing out the message. It didn't seem to make any sense. At least, not until Barbara realized that it was written backwards. Sarah couldn't remember the exact message, but she remembered enough for us to get excited. She remembered it was about a place, a safe haven in New Hampshire. It said something about going to the Dragon, too, but we couldn't work out what that meant. Barbara was sure it was from the government or something. Sarah said, "I saw a doubt," scrawled on Luke's face, but he kept his thoughts to himself. We asked more questions. Barbara had been adamant that the safe haven was the answer to their prayers, literally to her. This Morse code message had seemed like a sign from God, and she told the children as much. Sarah believed it fervently. We have to go there. All the children of America will be gathering there to stay safe and start over. I had never met Barbara, but I had to give it to her. She knew how to sell an idea. Turns out, she had no clue where it actually was. But the plan had been to head to New Hampshire and worry about the rest later. The day after the Morse code had been decoded, Barbara had loaded the kids into the church bus and started the trek north to New Hampshire. They were just entering Fort Carter when the red Toyota had run them off the road and the looters had taken them prisoner. From Sarah's memory, that had been January 4th. The same day that I had ventured into town to find supplies and met Luke. The looters had taken their captives to a trailer park where they had apparently made their base. Sarah wouldn't tell us about what had happened while she was a prisoner, other than to say that the oldest looter had taken Barbara off to a separate trailer. Almost as soon as they had arrived, the kids had never seen her again. Every day since, the looters had put them in the pickup and taken them on scavenger runs. I didn't want to think about what had happened to Barbara. Was she still captive in one of the trailers? Or worse, dead? Sarah had no idea where the trailer park was, but I didn't think it would be too hard to find. We listened to the last of her story. They had been on a scavenger run that morning, and the stop near Walt's Diner had been the first of the day. While the younger looter had been busy smoking his shotgun resting against his leg, Johnny, the same kid who had deciphered the Morse code, had nodded to her and the 7-year-old boy Brent to make a run for it. Johnny had been talking about escaping for days, but this was the first opportunity they'd had where they weren't either bound or being watched over properly. The shotgun-toting delinquent, clearly not as distracted as they thought, had shot Brent in the back as they ran towards the diner. Sarah and Johnny managed to make it into the alleyway, but Johnny had stumbled and fallen. His last words to Sarah had been to tell her to keep running. His death was the result of the second shot I had heard while retrieving the revolver. I made it out the back and hid behind a dumpster, Sarah said then. When he stopped and started going through the stuff in the car out back, I snuck back and tried the door. That's when you found me. There was an old radio in the kitchen. Luke and I had never turned it on, but after hearing Sarah's story, he checked it and found the battery still worked. We moved the station bar around for a while, looking for anything other than static, but found ourselves getting no place fast. Maybe the place, this dragon safe place, has been taken out by the Chinese already, Luke said. Just a little bit longer, I said, moving on to another station frequency. It was a church retreat, right? Maybe they were listening to AM. Nobody listened to AM radio, man, Luke said, looking at me incredulously. My foster mother did, on Thursday evenings. AM 1107 used to have a gospel hour. All right, we can try it if you want. I pushed the button that switched the radio from FM to AM and began slowly cycling through the frequencies. Nothing. I cycled through the dials twice and was ready to give up. Remember, it didn't play all the time. It came on about every 5 minutes, she said. Don't give up yet. I dialed through again 3 times, ignoring Luke's. On the 3rd time, the radio beeped as I cycled through. Go back, yelled Luke and Sarah in perfect unison. We had found it. The broadcast was just as Sarah had described, a sequence of long and short beeps. I know nothing about Morse code, and although Luke had been a scout, he didn't have a clue either.
There was no way we could decipher it, so we simply accepted that the message would be largely the same as Sarah had related to us. For now, that was good enough. Luke and I sat down at a table in the dining room while an exhausted Sarah slept fitfully in the kitchen. We have to go there, right? Sure, maybe. I'm not sure you do realize New Hampshire is 2 states away, and we don't have even a rough idea of where in the state it might be. Do we have a choice? Do you want to wait here for the Chinese ground troops as we run out of food? No, it's just... It might really suck is all. Oh, it's going to suck all right, I replied. Especially as we'll have to walk it. What? Why? I think the Chinese are looking for moving vehicles, probably with satellites or something. I don't think it's a coincidence that the first moving vehicle we've seen in days shows up a few minutes before a Chinese chopper. I don't know about you, but I don't really want to be driving if it's a possibility we'll end up like... I waved vaguely in the direction of the street. Luke grimaced. Could have been a coincidence, he said quietly. Do you want to risk it? I asked. Fine, we walk. We're gonna need some warmer clothes, though, he said, picking at his t-shirt. Yep, our first stop is going to be Walmart.
Hopefully it's as well stocked as the grocery store was. Now, what about this dragon in the message? Maybe we can work it out and find it on the map. Okay, I'll think on it, he said. We should be able to pick up a map or an atlas at Walmart. Luke packed up food to take with us on the road, while I carried a linen tablecloth from the diner's storeroom and went out to the alley. Sarah's friend Johnny was face down on the cold, hard concrete near the entrance. It was the third dead body I'd seen in a week, and it didn't get any easier. In fact, this was worse. Much worse. As upsetting as it was seeing the lifeless bodies of people I loved, this was just a poor little kid. The waste of innocent life hit me hard. Tears stung my eyes as I knelt and draped the tablecloth over him. I sat back on my haunches and took a deep breath, cursing the Chinese and the dumb cruelty of the looters. I put my hand gently on the shape of his head. I was in no mood to say a prayer. "Rest in peace, buddy," I said hoarsely, before heading back inside. Hi, it's Audiobook. Thank you for listening to Part 1 of Hell Week, which is Book 1 of the America Falls series. If you'd like to hear more, please click the subscribe button below or throw me a like, and please share.